Hey, and welcome to the Transition Discoveries Learning Series. This video is all about supporting transition planning for young people with disabilities. Let's talk about a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, this video is designed to be interactive, and that means that you'll watch and at different points pause the video in order to practice new skills. After each pause, we'll continue with new content. The time points of these pauses are listed for you in the video description in case you need to start this video over at any point. All practice activities are going to be done within a worksheet that you'll have to download from Schoology and then upload once you're finished. Finally, we recommend pausing this video if you need any extra time to engage with some of the text content or visuals shown. When it comes to transition planning, we often place a heavy focus on Indicator 13 compliance, and rightfully so, because it's really critical that we ensure that all students have detailed transition goals that are developed from age-appropriate transition assessments, and that these goals are created in collaboration with students, families, and agencies. We then make sure that they are followed up with a detailed plan for a program of study and related services to support them in reaching these goals. But how about moving beyond compliance? What might an evidence-based approach to extending this model of transition planning look like? For this video, we're going to unlock the secrets behind effective practices for moving transition planning beyond compliance towards innovation. We'll do this by using the Transition Discovery Framework, specifically its indicators for transition planning, in order to extend aspects of the 6-step process for Indicator 13 compliance. Our extensions will focus on increasing youth, family, and stakeholder collaboration. And to do this, we will introduce the use of universal design for learning into the transition assessment process. We will also dive into specific strategies for conducting ongoing, often called formative, assessment that are possible once compliance has been met. This includes how to collect and compile multiple sources of data for direct use by teams of youth, families, and stakeholders who then use that in not only defining baseline and growth, but actually co-writing the present level of academic and functional performance, as well as the measurable transition goals and the plan to achieve them. Here we have what this extended evidence-based model of transition planning can look like. Our inputs include our relevant laws and regulations, as well as equal participation by students, families, and stakeholders as decision makers and knowledge brokers who together share their thoughts, experiences, and recommendations as active contributors to the transition planning process. This information is continually gathered through age-appropriate transition assessments. These assessments should be both formal and informal, and include data that's collected equally from multiple sources, including students, families, and stakeholders. In addition, all assessment opportunities should be universally designed. We'll talk a lot more about this later on in the video. When summarizing results into the present level of academic and functional performance, we should compile results across types and groups into visuals that demonstrate to all team members, so youth, families, and stakeholders, baseline but also growth over time. We need to provide pre-work opportunities for students and families where they unpack that data and help them to understand that data over time from those transition assessments. We also want to provide opportunities for youth, families, and stakeholders to present on different findings from transition assessments. And we really want to ensure that teams of youth, families, and stakeholders get opportunities to group write that present level of academic and functional performance according to all of that transition assessment data that they've collected and talked about and learned about. In continuing this level of youth, family, and stakeholder collaboration, our next step is to create appropriate, measurable post-secondary goals, so post-secondary education and training, employment, and independent living, that are updated annually by this team and are based on age-appropriate transition assessments that are tied directly to annual measurable goals. This is where our sub-indicators of transition planning and the required categories for goals under Indicator 13 come in. So these include employment, independent living, and post-secondary education. The teams of youth, families, and stakeholders must then work together to decide on a program of study to reach these goals. Youth and families need to have ongoing opportunities to provide recommendations into what we often call the grid, right? So making that transition plan. And this includes services and supports that they feel will help them best. As the plan is implemented, the same principles of transition assessment that we talked about before are then applied during the progress monitoring stage. Age-appropriate transition assessments should be both formal and informal. So formal assessments, such as academic or behavioral evaluations, are often standardized and allow for comparison across students according to some criterion. So that might be advanced, proficient, primer level. The idea is that you have some criterion or level of performance that you can measure students accordingly. Informal assessments can be interviews, questionnaires, direct observations, which are often done with a checklist of some sort, completed by a stakeholder or a teacher, a parent, as well as student reflections and self-assessment. So these are two additional types of informal assessments. So see this pie chart here and its percentages? These are rough benchmarks for how much effort and data should be attributed to each type of assessment. Importantly, both informal and formal assessments can be used to measure different aspects of a student's growth toward a specific transition goal. We should take a person-centered approach to creating the present level of academic and functional performance. This means that educators, transition staff, student, family, and agency and community partners, which might be employers or nonprofits, all need to work together in order to write parts of this document. And this might include educators reviewing results with students and families, face-to-face or virtual meetings for discussing growth, strengths, and needs that include youth, families, and stakeholders together, as well as collaborating together and maybe making a collaborative space or an online or a physical document that allows for individual contributions in an accessible and flexible way. So this is all about individuals digging into some of the results and information that's used to create that present level of academic and functional performance, and then having a direct hand in informing what that language looks like. Speaking of transition assessment, it's not just about using multiple types of assessment. We also need to collect information from youth, families, and stakeholders with these different types of tools. So why? Well, the purpose of transition assessment is to build a complete picture of a student's interests, support needs, successful support strategies, and performance in various activities, as well as their family connections. So we can't accomplish that with one or two sources of data that are collected only from stakeholders evaluating students, particularly if that happens once a year. Data collected about environments that students interact with, such as school, work, and home, coupled with data from self-assessments and assessments by family or stakeholders, allow us to build out an in-depth profile of a student's skills, knowledge, and goals, as well as their daily routines and responsibilities or challenges within them. We can also get some information on their relationships, associations, friendships, their community connections across contexts, which might be school, home, work, and the community. When we do this, it helps us to understand what students do well and what environments do well for them. And we also learn about what students can improve on and what can be improved on in environments to better support students in reaching their goals for a desired level of independence related to those transition goals. So doing this results in student-centered transition goals, identifying options for skill building, supports, modifications, and connections within and outside of schools that both prepare them to reach their goals and to improve post-secondary environments that they'll be going into. And it also helps us gather information to inform goals that will directly inform their program of study and the decisions we make about the programs and supports and services that help them make it successfully through that program of study. So some of these informal approaches to transition assessment that might be used ongoing include meeting and interviewing with people identified by the student and family with the student and family permission that they feel know the student best. We might also use some age-appropriate informal and formal assessment, such as the ones we've been talking about today, as well as a record review, which might involve looking at academics, their IEPs from previous years, reports from agencies and service providers. We might also use some informal tactics such as real-world observations. And in doing this, we could, in addition to assessment and interviews, we could spend time with a young person in the community as they participate in their daily and weekly routines at school, work, maybe leisure, shopping. And the goal is to conduct a direct observation to learn more about that student's strengths, preferences, and needs across these contexts within a real-world situation. And it's important to gather information on how these social and physical environments support and challenge a student's success. So this gets us some additional informal data above and beyond some of our situational or environmental assessments like checklists that we might use. So if we know that transition assessments should be ongoing, meaning that it is used formatively to drive planning processes, how can we capitalize on it as a tool for supporting self-determination skills and opportunities to build those for transition-age youth? Well, this is really best described as a cyclical process of first and continuously documenting growth in a way that involves frequent and consistent use of both formal and informal assessments throughout each semester or at close to the same time points throughout the year. And this data should be collected from students, families, stakeholders, and it should include assessments of situational or environmental conditions across work, school, and home, like we've been talking about. Then, we summarize the transition assessment results according to the principles of UDL and provide ongoing opportunities for students to learn about their progress via these formal and informal assessment results. We take it further through students working alongside IEP teams and stakeholders to make a person-centered and data-informed decision about their transition goals in relation to their strengths, preferences, and needs as documented and identified by this transition assessment data. This helps us and helps students in building their self-awareness and self-determination skills, and it helps us to help them build those skills. This helps students in building their self-awareness and self-determination skills. So the potential for an incomplete profile of student growth is real without following through with multiple sources from youth families and stakeholders that provide data formally and informally. However, where data comes from is only one part of the picture. Transition assessments need to provide youth with multiple means of representation, action and expression, and engagement for them to share about their strengths, skills, knowledge, and preferences. We need to evaluate student strengths, preferences, challenge, academic performance, and functional behavior performance across contexts from school, work, and home. And we need to use evaluations of how they are influenced by factors within these different contexts. Importantly, transition assessment is not a static process. It happens continuously throughout the year. As we engage in progress monitoring, the other part of our work revolves around working with students and families to help them understand results from their transition assessment. We might also use instruction and learning opportunities for students to review their transition assessment data so that they can build their capacity to identify their strengths and needs. Evidence-based approaches to supporting this include modeling the inner talk or self-reflection, which we often call metacognition, and working with students as they prepare to present on their growth to the team. Since transition assessment is an ongoing process that's focused on measuring growth, we need to use new or additional assessments as students achieve their annually updated transition goals. Many assessments are designed in a leveled approach that measures a specific range of a skill. Students above that skill level range, either due to performance and/or age, would be poorly evaluated with that tool since they would likely always score at the highest possible level, given that they might have mastered it already, or the lowest level if they haven't had access to programs or services to support it yet. Given that we focus on figuring out where students are in order to make data-informed decisions about where they want to go and how close they are to getting there, a tool like this really wouldn't support that effort. We need to match what our students can do with a tool that measures where they are and above their current level of performance, so then we can measure their growth over time. So, with so much data, how do we make sense of it in a way that youth, families, and stakeholders can speak the same language? That's the big question. All right, so I think it's time to put all this information into some real-world context and get at what these approaches can actually look like. Let's say that we've collected informal assessment data on how well a student is completing job applications through self-assessments of their abilities and teacher assessments of how well they are doing on some kind of checklist. We have also collected formal assessment data through the Keystone and focused on the nonfiction total score, since this is a measure of literacy skills that are likely transferable to independent reading, understanding, and completing job applications. So let's say that the skills on the Keystone align with the student's annual measurable goal, and together these informal assessments align well with their goal of being able to obtain paid employment independently. As we continuously collect this data each month of the school year, We should be making data-informed decisions about a student's current knowledge, skills, and growth in relation to their current and potential programs and services available to them. In keeping with our goal, we should be visualizing multiple sources of informal and formal transition assessment data in a way that can facilitate students and families becoming informed team members while also ensuring that stakeholders have the maximum amount of information possible so that they can make sound recommendations for programs of study and related transition services that are going to help the students achieve success towards these programs of studies and their post-secondary goals. In this example, I have results from the assessments that we just spoke about, and students and families need to see this data in real time over the course of the year and have opportunities to set goals based upon it. So we might chart out the results and then have students mark off where they are and their goals on that chart as well. So where they are and then a goal down the line, a couple months about what that could be. And they can mark that on the data chart. We might use this chart and then have students write reflections or complete a graphic organizer based upon the information, and they could talk about their strengths, needs, and preferences in relation to their transition goals. This helps students to become expert decision makers who use tools and data to think objectively about their progress and use that information to create goals for themselves. So we should be meeting to discuss midpoint progress and to make decisions on how current services, supports, and a program of study are supporting the student in reaching their transition goals. In this example here, we see that the student has made improvements according to the informal assessments used by jumping on average about 1 or 2 total score points, but they are still pretty far from their goal of a total score of 7. And we see that given the amount of time that has passed, about 4 months, additional support might be needed for them to increase an additional 3 or 4 total score points in order for them to reach their goals they've set and the goals that they've set with their families during this remaining months of the school year. So this right here would be an example of data-informed decision-making with young people and families. So here's an example of what transition assessment data from these 3 sources might look like when graphed for a whole year. Notice how we have the formal assessment data for the previous grades and for the grade coming up, that next grade year for 11th grade. So this is an example of showing growth across years so that decisions can be made that take a longer term approach both before the current grade and after. And this helps current teachers get an informed view about a student's progress before they work with them. So this is a really important approach and strategy for building continuity about what teachers and staff know about the students that they're working with year over year, because each year different staff and teachers are often working with different students. So here we have an example, a new example of an independent living goal being graphed. So we should collect and review data from observational notes and interviews, so these are informal transition assessments, throughout the year in order to inform the team, so that's youth, families, and stakeholders, about what growth towards reaching those transition goals looks like in context. So that could be school, home, in the community, at work. And this means that we're going to be using these other sources of qualitative data, so written data, to help us contextualize the results from these transition assessments we typically use, which most often have numerical scores associated with them. So this is what the data might look like if we continued collecting it over the course of the entire year and used it to inform our decision making about programs and services in the student's program of study. So really exciting, we've created an easy-to-use tool for teams to implement this strategy of charting multiple sources of transition assessment data and then working with students and families to help them understand progress so that they can, together with stakeholders, make informed decisions about transition goals as well as the programs and services to reach them. So before we continue on with this video, if you haven't already done so, please download the file My Data is Self-Determined, and this is a tool that we're going to be using in this video with some examples. You can get this off our Schoology course, and you'll need it for an upcoming activity in this video. By default, this transition assessment visualization tool, this data tool, will chart only one scale for a total score. So that's fine if all of your formal or informal assessments are on the same scale. out of the same total. So maybe they're, 5 out of a total of 100, or often if it's a formal assessment or a standardized assessment, the scales are pretty large. So this could be a problem, but that's okay because we can fix how this looks on our visualization. What you'll have to do is chart the assessments on the large scale apart from all the assessments on the smaller scale. So by doing this, it makes it possible to visualize growth. And if we don't, what happens is we have, let's say, some formal assessments that are on this large scale. Maybe it starts at 200 and ends at 1800. But you have an informal assessment that's on from 1 to 10. And then your growth on your informal assessment looks tiny. You can't see any, you can't visualize any of the growth. It looks not that meaningful. It looks like the magnitude is small when it's really pretty significant, and there's definitely some growth going on there. So what we're going to do is make sure you have two separate scales on the same chart. So you'll have your numerical scale for your formal assessment, typically have a larger scale, and then your informal that have a smaller scale. So let's learn how to fix this. What we want to do is, once you've typed in all of your data, you're going to click on the line for each one of those assessments that have the smaller scale, those informal assessments, one at a time. And then you'll click on the format option in the far right top menu, and that'll bring up another side menu bar on the right-hand side. And in that menu, you're going to click the option for secondary access. And then what's going to happen is a new secondary access is going to appear, and that'll be your other scale for your informal assessments with the smaller scale, maybe 1 out of 10 or something like that. And then all you want to do is name that informal assessments, that scale, so this way you're able to tell the difference between your formal on the left and your informal on the right. Here's an example within Excel of how to complete these steps. And just to recap, here are those steps again. All right, so for this first pause and practice, we're going to take some time to try some of these strategies and tools out that we've just been talking about. What you want to do is open up your video worksheet and also open up the file called My Data is Self-Determined. And this is a tool that's been created for you that'll help you to create either monthly or daily transition assessment visualizations. In this example, in this activity, we're going to do a monthly visualization. So in this case example here, we have results from 3 different assessments. We have a formal assessment, and that's from a student, and we have 2 informal assessments, a family checklist and a teacher checklist. Some additional information is that both the informal assessments have a minimum score of 0 and a maximum score of 15. And those formal assessment there, the student assessment, has a minimum score of 125 and a maximum score of 500. So let's say that there are 125 items on this formal assessment, which we know are typically criterion-based, right? So we're looking to grade students against the performance of a larger group. And each is worth between 1 and 4 points. So that's how you get a 125 if they get all 1s and a 500 if they get all 4s. This data is provided for you here in your worksheet, and I'm showing it here on the table for you as well, but it's in your worksheet. And your tasks here are to first chart this data for each assessment above as taught in the video, and make sure that the informal assessments have their own secondary axis with a proper scale that matches the range of possible scores for those assessments. So the scale should be 0 to 15. You're going to right-click on the completed chart and select Save as Picture, and then paste that picture into the video worksheet once you've completed it. The second task, really important, is we want to contextualize this tool, this visualization, which in a way that we'd actually use it in practice. So your second part of this activity is to draw upon the evidence-based strategies explained in this video in terms of using data visualizations as a tool for supporting self-determination and youth and family engagement in transition planning and goal writing. In order to write a short description or explanation of how you could use this visualization approach and tool with students or families during the process of creating their transition goals and their plan. So at this point, you're going to work on this activity. You can pause the video, and once you've completed this activity, resume the video because we have more content and another activity a little bit later on. All right, so switching gears here, what about UDL and informal transition assessment? So this is a topic we've kind of touched briefly upon throughout this video, and let's take a deeper dive into it. And when it comes to multiple options of representation, what you want to do is remember to review all questions on the assessment with students who will be taking it, to check for comprehensible language, appropriate vocabulary, and to remove any unnecessarily complex sentences. You can use reading level checkers such as readable.com or Grammarly to check your assessment for these different characteristics. You're also going to want to ask yourself if there are multiple ways for comprehending each assessment question. So that could be text, speaking, text-to-speech functions, video, audio recordings, pictures, symbols, and colors. And if those options are available to all students so that they can independently access the questions being asked without the need for multiple versions of the same assessment. You also want to remember that assessments often have a set option for students to choose from in order to evaluate their skills, knowledge, or preferences. And you want to make sure that the multiple choice options are presented in more than one way. So maybe you've got a text, but you've also got color coded or pictures, symbols, maybe an audio description of each option as well. You also want to make sure that in terms of multiple means of representation that you read the assessment and make sure that the font color, the style, the size, the background are all set for maximum readability for each student. And you also want to review it to see if the assessment is using ADA-friendly fonts such as Tahoma, Calibri, Helvetica, Arial, Verdana, or Times New Roman. So that's representation covered. In terms of multiple engagement for preferences and needs, you want to make sure that the amount of questions that is shown at the same time on the assessment has been set to a level that will support readability and comprehension by reducing the amount of information overload. So you might show one question at a time, 2 or 3 or 4 questions at a time. You also want to ensure that students are aware that they have the option to complete the assessment in chunks with breaks as needed. So part of that is providing that opportunity to them, of course. You also want to have students talk about the purpose of the assessment in their daily lives and in relation to their future goals before they even take it. You want to make sure that students that are taking the assessment have real-time feedback so that they can self-monitor their growth and progress. So you might do this by showing students how many questions are completed and how many are left, the results of their assessment once completed, each time and over time, so like we were talking about before with graphing it and including that in conversations, and ensuring that notifications and applications on the digital device, if you're going to use a digital one, are turned off to reduce distractions. And finally, for multiple options for expression and action, we want to make sure that there are multiple ways for students to respond to each assessment question. So not only are we providing the questions themselves and the options to respond to them in text for speaking, text-to-speak functions, video or audio recording, pictures, symbols, and colors. So for all those different ways that we present the information, we also want to have all those different ways for them to present their responses. We want to make sure those options are available to all students and that can access them independently without the need for multiple versions of the same assessment. So many tablets and phones have the option for feedback that can be changed on the fly, and that can happen through what we call haptics. So you can have tablets or phones, if you're doing your assessments that way, give clicks or vibrations when the screen is touched. And you might want to ensure that students who need that, even if they don't, if they have the option to consider that for themselves, or maybe they can turn that on and off independently for themselves as they're taking it. So based upon your professional knowledge and the strategies discussed in this video, let's take some time to do this second and final pause and practice. What you're going to want to do is take out your video worksheet and respond to the final 3 questions. So those are: how might you provide multiple means of representation to students during the transition assessment process related to an independent living goal? How might you provide multiple means of action expression to students during the transition assessment process related to preparing for employment? And then finally, how might you provide multiple means of engagement to students during the transition assessment process for post-secondary and college planning? So once you've completed these, you can unpause the video and we'll continue on with just a little bit more content. So make sure that you resume the video after this slide for just a little bit more content, and then we'll wrap things up. So just to wrap things up, in Innovating Indicator 13, Transition Planning, the 3 things we want to do is increase the depth of information gathered by conducting transition assessment data ongoingly. That's formal and informal with youth, families, and stakeholders. Second, we want to introduce the use of UDL into the transition assessment process using the strategies we talked about. And third, we want to implement a team-based approach where students, families, and stakeholders co-review transition assessment data and then co-create goals and the plan to achieve them based upon it.